According to Pennsylvania University, we are the #1 think tank in Pakistan. We are in top 12 in Asia and Pacific. And other than US think tanks, we are in top 100 globally in 13 different categories. Our objective is to work with the government to promote the voice of the people, to work with the government to design, influence, and affect policies for the greater benefit of the people. We cover economy, climate change, migration. We have our own Center for Learning and Development, which is trainings. And even I think in just this last year, we have trained more than 500 public sector officers. So we work very closely with the federal and the provincial governments. We are running Pakistan's one of the largest green energy transition program, very closely working with the Ministry of Climate Change. Our executive director, Dr. Abid Soleri, was the member of an international advisory committee of the presidency of Baku for COP29. He is also a member of 2 of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Councils of the 2 Prime Ministers. So this really tells that how closely we work with the government. So this was just a brief on SDPI. But I think one of the hallmark of SDPI is our belief in exchange of ideas, because we always believe that this is the exchange of ideas that really opens up new windows, the horizons for your policy design, how you think of the policy. So in this context, we have been very lucky to bring people from all across we have Pakistan's largest sustainable development conference. This is Pakistan's the largest policy conference every year from last 27 years. We're holding it. This year, I think it was around 26 countries representation that we have we very closely work on the national issues, the regional issues, and the global issues. SDPI has been a great champion for cross-border collaborations for the sustainable development. And particularly right now, we have a higher focus on green development. And this is where when Dr. Amir, if you can pronounce the next word, what is the Ladhui? Exactly. Thank you. We came to know that you are visiting Pakistan. I know that you have a very busy schedule, so we requested Dr. Amir to please give us a session on particularly his book, Survival of the Greenest. This is really interesting title. I mean, I have found very few that catchy titles, that survival of the fittest from the survival of the greenest. And that is more on economic transformation in a climate conscious world. And I think it's really more than half of SDPI is right now working one way or the other on a green transition, climate change, green energy, green carbon markets, carbon pricing, all these. And we are very closely working with the NDCs with the Ministry of Climate Change. So I think it was a very relevant discussion, and thank you so much for accepting our request and to join us. For the sake of introduction, Dr. Amir is Associate Professor of the Political Economy of Development and Director of Technology and Management Center for Development at University of Oxford. By training, he is a development economist and more focuses on economic diversification of resource-dependent nations and green industrial policy and low carbon innovations, commodity value addition, and biodiversity-based development. Today, we will be more hearing about his work, his thoughts, but centrally on the survival of the greenest. Over to you, Dr. Amir. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Salam alaikum. It's a real pleasure to be in Pakistan, but also to engage with SDPI, which I have heard about for many years. So thank you again for hosting this book presentation. First of all, let me emphasize that as we discussed the topic, the idea was also to discuss the implications for Pakistan. I, unfortunately and shamelessly, know very little about the conditions, in your country. I mean, you, especially with the work that you have been doing, you know a lot more about the reality on the ground, the specific priority challenges. So I will do my best to, highlight some of the items that could be more relevant. And I look forward to the discussion afterwards, where hopefully we can discuss what concretely that means for Pakistan, but also how does that link with some of the work that SDPI does on those issues. So, is it possible to put the slides in full screen? Because now I think it's cutting it. So adjusting it to the size of the screen.
Can you adjust slides?
Yeah, perfect. Wonderful. So next slide, please. The book, as Dr. Sajid mentioned, it's called Survival of the Greenest, and this is inspired by Charles Darwin's famous work on the survival of the fittest. But more precisely, there is something that Charles Darwin says, which is very relevant today. He wrote that it's not the most of the intellectual of the species that survives, not even the strongest, but those are able to best adapt and adjust to the changing environment in which it finds itself. Now, this is true for us as the human species, but it's also true for economies, for development strategy, that actually on the long term, if you look at historical trajectory, there's always technological disruption, there's always market shifts, exogenous shocks. So the economies that are able to perform are not the ones that have the best strategy from the beginning. It's actually those that are really able to adapt, right, and change, right, according to circumstances. And the main argument of the book is that this is also very much true of how we deal with climate change. Basically, the point of the book is, which maybe it's not the same as the SDPI line, is that even if you don't care about climate change or about the environment, even if you don't care about trees, you should still, even if you don't have a historic responsibility for climate change, if you haven't caused it like Pakistan, have not contributed much to global greenhouse emissions, still, it's in your best interest to green the productive structures of your economy, right? Even if you're fossil fuel producing nations. Because sometimes you hear, especially in developing countries, especially in ministries of finance or economists that say, oh, but climate change is the problems that the rich countries have caused. So let them deal with it. Why do we have to, pay the cost of it? And that's very much true. But if you don't green your productive structures, you'll be left out from a global green economy. Next slide, please. And here, the point of survival is not just for the catchiness of the title, because it's actually really a matter of human survival, but also of economic survival. And just to prove this point, one of the biggest development economics horror stories comes from the island nation of Nauru in the Pacific. Nauru, few people know, used to be one of the richest nations in the world in the 1970s, right? It had a GDP per capita, income per capita of $27,000, right? In the 70s, thanks to the extraction of its rich phosphate deposits. So what you see, the first picture is a photograph of the then president of Nauru in front of his Rolls Royce in a New York Times article, basically talking about the world's richest island, no? But a few decades later, the inevitable happened. Phosphates are obviously non-renewable, so they ran out of phosphate. But the process of extraction of phosphate in Nauru was done in an environmentally damaging way, which means that they destroyed the arable land that was around it, and they couldn't grow food anymore, which used to be the main source of income for populations in the previous centuries. So then Nauru went back from being a high-income country back to being a low-income country. And nowadays, the main source of income for the island is that they're using the island to host a refugee detention center on behalf of Australia. And this story really shows, this is a dramatic story of decline, but unfortunately, it's also a cautionary tale because this has happened to other countries. It will happen to many other countries, right? And that shows that environmental considerations are not just ecological, they're also economic ones. And this is very important to remember. The other thing is, if you think about Nauru, now it's too late. They've done the damage. They've done the decline. It's irreversible. If you had to change that, you would have to go back to the decision in which, when the development strategy was implemented and designed. So what the case of Nauru also shows us, and that's a message that is worth hammering over and over again, especially with politicians, is that it's present decisions that determine future production possibilities. So this is far away from the logic of grow now and clean up later. Because no, if you actually grow now in a carbon intensive way, you're locked in. Sometimes the damage is done. You miss out on the window of opportunity for green industries, and you might end up like Nauru. So this really shows the urgency of thinking now ahead for the future and not just leave it for future generations to figure it out. Next slide, please. Now, in the context of Pakistan, and I mean, this is not going to be anything new to you. And again, I look forward to learning more about the work that you've been doing in this area. But as you know well, and as we've seen in recent years with floods and other climate-induced disasters in Pakistan, Pakistan is highly vulnerable to climate change, both from a human point of view, but also from an economic point of view. It's one of the countries that is listed as one of the most climate vulnerable in indices, global indices of climate vulnerability. Next slide, please. But this exposure to climate and transition risks also deeply affects Pakistan's productive structures. If you look at Pakistan's exports basket, half of it is from the garment sector, which I was just very briefly reading on, and some of the work that Pakistani scholars have done, and they really show that even the textile sector is highly vulnerable to climate change, right? Not only in terms of the declining production of cotton, but also in terms of transition risks, right? As consumer demand is shifting more to garment and textiles that are produced in a cleaner way. So going green is really an imperative to retain access to consumer markets. So essentially, it seems that Pakistan, along with most other developing nations, is being punished 4 times. It's being punished because it's more exposed to climate change and its impact, so it's more exposed to climate risks. It's also punished because it's also exposed to transition risks, right? Even if we manage to deal with climate change, if the whole world goes green and Pakistan's energy matrix still relies on fossil fuels, it will lose its so-called carbon cost competitiveness, especially as you see more and more regulations in key consumer markets, the European carbon border adjustment mechanism, and so on. Then it has a triple punishment because credit rating agencies are increasingly taking into account those climate and transition risks, right, when they devise country scores. So if they perceive that a country is highly impacted by climate change, it makes it even more costly for them to borrow money in international markets, right? So on top of already being exposed to climate change, countries like Pakistan in the future will have to, pay a lot more in interest for the debt that they incur because of this perception of climate and transition risks. And lastly, and that's going to be the main point that I make throughout this presentation, Pakistan, along with many other developing nations, are being pushed out of green diversification opportunities. If you look at the transition, the global green economy, most of the valuable opportunities for development, they're being captured by a handful of already industrialized economies. So it's not the countries that are the most impacted by climate change that are also benefiting from the green economy, right? And that's next slide, please. And that's the main message from the book, which is that we know that there are great opportunities for development in the green economy, for green industrialization, for green innovation, but not everyone is equally positioned to benefit from these green windows of opportunities. Next slide. So there are three main channels through which sustainability brings an opportunity for economic transformation. The first one is what the scholars like Carlota Perez, Rasmus Lema, my colleague who was also director of the center that I lead in Oxford, Xiaolan Fu, had coined the green window of opportunity, right? And these are basically all the opportunities for industrialization that come out from deploying low carbon technology like solar panels, wind turbines. And essentially, this is the manufacturing of this technology, both the upstream and downstream part, right? So all, for example, the blades that you need for wind turbines that, can be localized, or the energy intensive downstream industries that could rely on renewable based electricity. The second one, which also relies on renewables, but it's a different mechanisms, is through the so-called fourth industrial revolution. So this is basically with the advent of cyber physical systems, things like artificial intelligence, big data, 3D printing, clouding services. So these are key, right, for technological upgrading, but they are extremely energy intensive, right? And now there's a lot more pressure, even for AI algorithm, to not be as dirty because they consume a lot of energy, but to move towards clean energy sources. So in the long term, for countries that won't have access to a clean, reliable, and cheap electricity matrix, they'll be, this will hinder their ability to access state-of-the-art technology for industrialization. And the third one is through the concept of environmental upgrading, where, in a radical departure from the past industrialization model, you generate value by adopting environmental measures, right? So essentially, when you reduce the resource intensity of what you produce, you can save costs, or you can reuse that waste, right, as an input in another industry. So according to circular economy principles. And there are some fantastic examples already starting. For example, in Uruguay, thanks to a program to help dairy farmers adopt circular economy principles, they start to reuse cow excrements as a source of biofuels, no? And in some of the dairy farms now, biofuel production represents more of their revenues than selling milk. So this is a fantastic example of diversification, which is something that they were not using in production processes, but now they are. But the point is, these opportunities are highly consolidated. So as you will notice, most of these, especially the first two, rely on access to renewable energy, right? Now, most of the potential for renewable energy, we know, exists in developing countries. Solar radiation, where wind blows, geothermal is mostly in Asia, Africa, Latin America. Now, just to give you a shocking example, Sub-Saharan Africa, you still have most of the world population that doesn't have access to electricity is in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? That's about 600 million people. So they don't have access to electricity. They have great potential for renewables, So from the logic, you would expect that this is where where the money is flowing for renewable energy. Now, we're seeing record investments in renewables worldwide year on year. If you put it in per capita terms, for the US and Canada, that's about $180. For Japan, it's about 140. For the EU, it's about 120. Guess what's the figure for Sub-Saharan Africa?
Less than 100.
Less than 100? Who has another estimate? $60? 80, can we go to the next slide? The correct answer is $1. So radically less than your estimations. And by the way, here $1 is a rounded up figure, and now it keeps reducing. So now it's closer to 0.4, 0.5. And this graph shows you a lot about what one needs to know about the inequity in the kind of renewable energy landscape. Most of the money is not flowing to where people are still lacking access to safe energy, but it's actually going to already industrialized nations, which are seeing those investments as a market opportunity, right? As an economic opportunity or as a geostrategic interest. And this is a big problem, especially in terms of fulfilling. You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, right, as part of the mission of SDPI, but this basically is breaking the central promise of the UN Sustainable Development Goals of leaving no one behind. And you can see as well that South Asia is not receiving much funding either, despite the idea these are the places where the world would benefit the most, right, from having green industrial opportunities there. Next slide. So a lot of the reason there is that renewable energy projects, so investments, not driven by labor, land, or construction costs mainly, but actually mostly by other considerations. And here, have you done work on cost of capital at the SDPI?
I think Dr. Khalid is doing. He's not here, unfortunately, but he is doing.
Yeah. So basically, different countries face different costs of capital for renewable energy. So essentially, the issue with renewable energy is that there's a lot more upfront costs than for fossil fuels, for example, right? So most of the time, the way to finance those projects is by borrowing money. But here, the cost of debt, which is varies a lot across nations, has a huge impact on how attractive, right, those investments are from a profitability point of view. So there's been research, for example, in India showing that the cost of debt was leading to an increase of almost 40% of utility, of basically solar-based utility. And here, Pakistan, the weighted average cost of capital for solar PV is also one of the highest in the world, right? So this means that despite, even if Pakistan wanted to promote investments in renewable energy, it faces conditions that are much harsher than if Germany was to borrow capital for renewable energy projects, even though you might have a much higher potential for renewable energy projects here. This means that there are many kind of distortions, and it locks countries like Pakistan into carbon-intensive economic pathways, which is a problem, especially thinking again about the case of Nauru. But what this also means is that market forces will not be alone. Will not suffice, right? Won't be sufficient to be able to get you there, and that stronger policy interventions, not just to escort capital, but to really discipline capital into investing in renewables might be critical. Next slide. So the disparity that I just mentioned, you see it on the financial aspect, but you also see it at the industrial level. So in the development economics literature, especially those, explaining the East Asian miracle, one of the key ideas is that the capacity to export is critical for long-term development. And here, if you look at the exports of low carbon technologies, it's highly, highly concentrated. You only have 3 countries that account for half of global low carbon technology exports, namely China, Germany, and the US. It's extremely concentrated, right? And I mean, the rise of China is particularly impressive in that regard, and you can see that it's still growing. But you see that there are not many developing countries that are getting, a share of a piece of the pie in terms of the exports of low carbon tech. Next slide. Yeah. So when it comes to comparative advantage, this has considerable implications. Because what you see from this map is that, who has a comparative advantage in low carbon technology products? Not many people, not many countries in the global south, right? It's mostly countries in North America, it's China and other countries in East Asia, and many European nations. And so this really shows that as things stand, global decarbonization will considerably increase global inequalities, both within but also between nations, and something must be done. So how do we move from there? I guess from a very simplistic way, we're at a crossroads where there are two ways. The first way is to adopt more of a neoclassical approach to this question and accept comparative advantages as a given, accept that, if you're a developing country, you accept that you've lost the race. Too bad. Others were better positioned, have better, infrastructure for it, and you just give up on this wave, hoping that something else will happen. Or you adopt a more heterodox approach to the question, especially a dynamic approach to the concept of comparative advantage, where comparative advantage is not given, it's not natural, but it's acquired, right? There's nothing inherent about Denmark, about Vietnam, about Malaysia or China that makes them particularly better at producing wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicles than Pakistan or Bangladesh or Algeria, where I'm from. A lot of the existing comparative advantages are not natural and don't even depend on natural resource abundance, but actually are policy induced. And there's often this myth that it's your natural resource endowment that determines, right, your ability to move into particular value chains. But in many ways, that you don't see this happening for low carbon technologies. Even in the developing world, many countries have a lot of critical minerals, right? But where do you see low carbon technology products happening? Even in global south, it's in the countries that did not rely on their resources, but on their pre-existing industrial capabilities. For example, on that map, you'll see that Malaysia is green. Malaysia is the second largest exporter of solar cells in the world. And it didn't do it because of its palm oil, rubber, or even petroleum resources. It did it because of its pre-existing electronics sector and the skills, the technology that was able to repurpose towards solar cell production. Brazil is becoming one of the largest manufacturers of wind turbines. But it's done it because it was able to leverage pre-existing capabilities in aerospace engineering, because the technology for turbines in planes is very similar to the technology for turbines for wind. Same with Mexico. They're starting to export electric vehicles, but that's thanks to the pre-existing automotive sector, right? So you see that in those stories, natural resources are not really what matters. A lot of it is the skills, the capabilities, and of course, the policy environment that is able to push firms into achieving particular targets. I think some of you might know this, but even when it comes to in the past 50, 60 years ago, countries like South Korea or Japan, when they started to build cars, people in the West were making fun of them. The first Japanese cars or Korean cars were absolutely horrendous, very poor technology. They looked absolutely terrible. My PhD supervisor, who's Korean, Hajun Cheng, he always gives those examples to see that people really made fun of the technology that was coming out of Korea. But the whole point is that they persevered, they tried to improve it. There was a long-term vision and learning from mistakes. And by the way, for Toyota, and some of you might know this, but it took Toyota 40 years to become profitable. For 40 years, it was making losses, right? And being subsidized by the government. But what was important from the government point of view is that they were still improving, right? And today, Toyota is highly competitive. So this shows that you don't just suddenly, right, land these capabilities. They really need to be acquired, fought for. And it's a fight because the incumbents are not there to help you. And you see it throughout history in different industrial sectors. And now we see it again in low carbon technologies. Next slide, please. So the Hajun Cheng has written this famous book called Kicking Away the Ladder, in which he explains that rich countries are preventing poorer nations from using the same tools that those rich countries used to develop, namely protectionism, industrial policies, and so on. And now you see the same thing happening in green sectors, right? So now we are witnessing a big revival of industrial policy around the world, right? Of heavy state intervention in the economy, especially to develop green sectors. But those are mostly motivated by geostrategic interests, right? In the US, in the EU, in China, as a way to capture those market shares. And they are doing it in a way that makes it very difficult for developing nations to pursue the same instruments. So I'm sure that here at CDPI, you must have a lot of contacts and connections with a lot of foreign development agencies, whether it's the German one, whether it's the French one, and others. And here, what I would like to, really emphasize is that you have to be very cautious of what is the greenness, or how do those agencies or partners define green. They claim that, especially European governments, that a lot of what they do is basically for climate change, right? But here, the devil is in the details. It's not so much about what they do or what they choose to focus on, is what they actually neglect, right? Is what is not in the policy programs. So let me ask you a question. Can you raise your hand if you do not think that bicycles are an environmentally friendly product? Now, can you raise your hand if you think that bicycles are an environmentally friendly product? Okay, so I think that's most of us here. Well, guess what? The European Union would disagree with you because they refused to include bikes in the environmental goods agreement at the WTO, right? Because this was an agreement to remove all tariffs on products that can help us fight climate change and reduce our emissions, right? So it includes wind turbines, electric vehicles, solar cells. And China suggested that we include bikes too, right? That can help reduce our emissions. And the EU refused because if they were removing tariffs on Chinese bikes, basically the entire European bicycle industry would disappear because Chinese bikes are much, much, much cheaper. And so for China, this was a great point of tension because it showed a lot of hypocrisy, because the whole point of the agreement is precisely to make it cheaper for people to access those goods. And this was one of the main tension points that led to the breakdown of the environmental agreements. And that's why we still do not have an environmental goods agreement. That's one of many examples, but I could go on for an hour about all the cases of hypocrisy where the EU, for example, promotes, one type of green tech, but actually, you show that this is more of a trade interest as opposed to a climate one. Copenhagen, you mentioned COP. At the COP in Copenhagen about 25 years ago, there was an agreement that rich countries would pay about $100 billion annually of climate finance to poor nations to deal with climate change. This target was never met. The US in particular missed its target by about $40 billion a year, right? So it only paid 7, it was supposed to pay $47 billion a year. 47 may seem like a big number, 47 billion, but just in the same time period, the US government spent $1 trillion, 1 trillion, on developing the F-45 fighter jet, pictured here, which was deemed not only the most expensive weapon in military history, but also the least used weapon in military history. This is just to show that the money is there. It's just not used, right, for the right purposes. And we see it also over the past year. The money is there to make war, right? But this not being deployed to just honor climate responsibilities, right? We're not even saying like, running the extra mile, just to honor promises. Next slide. A result that leads to my second point, which leads to the role of the government. And here, if you really want to fight, to defy existing comparative advantages and build new ones, especially in the green economy, that also entails a different role of the state. A state that doesn't just follow market forces, but a state that shapes productive capability accumulation towards building competitiveness in specific niches. So that means that the state, and I'm Algerian, so I love Zinedine Zidane. But that means that the state should be less like a referee that just sets the rules of the game and let the players, let the actors play, but more like a head coach. But you don't have to play. You don't have to be the captain that scores all the goals. You can be outside of the pitch and yet have a huge influence in setting the vision, the long-term strategy, the training capabilities that increases the chemistry between the different players, aka firms, and enables the whole team to increase its competitiveness in international games, in international competition, which leads us to the role of industrial policy. Next slide, please. The book goes into more details about, the kind of rise of green industrial policy, what it means, different examples, but perhaps one of the main points that I want to make here, because I know that Pakistan also had experiments with industrial policy in the past. One thing that is really different this time is that green industrial policy requires much greater coordination between different ministries, right? So this is something that I've seen over the past 3 years, especially when advising governments that were trying to implement a green or design a green industrial policy. The biggest problem was the interministerial coordination, because with industrial policy, and we see it with the East Asian Miracle, it was the mandate of the powerful Ministry of International Trade and Industry, right? They could drive the vision, it was within their mandate. But with green industrial policy, that's impossible, because you cannot have industrial policy that is not really well coordinated with the country's energy policy, that is not really well coordinated with the country's environmental policy, right? I didn't mention from the EU case, but environmental regulations are one of the ways that the EU, for example, for a long time was able to bypass WTO regulations to have a de facto import constraint, no? If they don't want to import your product, if they cannot tell you, if they cannot block it, they'll come up with a new regulation to say oh, those products need to meet, blah, 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 XYZ standard, which makes it so difficult for anyone that wants to access the market from the outside. And so, for example, in Malaysia, they've managed to do that with the Economic Planning Unit, which sits within the Prime Minister's office. And it's really empowered, right, to oversee what all the different ministries are doing and follow up. In China, and this is perhaps the greatest lesson that we can learn from the Chinese experience, it's a very different country. It's very large. It has different types of capabilities and culture and history. But so, of course, what they do is not necessarily applicable somewhere else. But the greatest lesson is their ability to do institutional learning by doing. In China, they, especially on green industrial policy, they did not hesitate to completely change even institutional structures of the government, just to, in terms of what works, through a trial and error process. So in 2013, they completely eliminated the Ministry of Energy because they realized that energy was a cross-ministerial issue. Right, you had to deal with energy in all different aspects. So it created too many kind of policy incoherence to have an energy policy driven by one single ministry. And instead they have a National Energy Commission. People in many countries where I present this work, they get a bit, ruffled when I even suggest eliminating the Ministry of Energy, because often it's one of the most powerful institutions. But the point here is not to eliminate it, but to find ways in which to smoothen this dialogue within a specific country. Brazil is a very interesting country as well, because it has been very ambitious for green industrialization, especially in the last 3 years, extremely ambitious, but actually too ambitious. Every single ministry in Brazil has its own green industrial policy strategy. The Ministry of Finance came up with something called the Ecological Transformation Plan. The Ministry of Energy has its own energy transition plan. The Ministry of Industry has a green industrial plan. The Ministry of Innovation has its own. And now you have all these 4 different plans. They really overlap. Sometimes they complement each other. Sometimes there are trade-offs and they're, going different directions. So, and this is due to a large degree of interministerial misalignment. So a friend from Mauritius, an economist from Mauritius once told me, when commenting about all the countries, that everyone has a new vision 2030, vision 2025 strategy, And she told me having a vision is good, but too many visions can lead to hallucinations. So this is where the intra-ministerial coordination unit is particularly important to avoid these hallucinations. Next slide. So in terms of industrial policy and lessons from the past, I often say that, you know, industrial policy has been a taboo subject in economics for a long time. People are either strongly for it or strongly against it, but it's a very unproductive dichotomy because industrial policy, it can work, it has risks, it all depends on how well they actually do it. So it should be seen as a calculated risk. But there are lessons that we can learn from the past that has worked particularly well and that still matter for the green industrial policy agenda. One is performance requirement for firms that receive state support, including on green industries. We know from the past century of industrial policy experiments that if you just give subsidies or R&D support to companies, you know, in different sectors, but you don't require them to reach particular targets, they will often miss the targets, right? And that can become an easy source of rent seeking, where you get this money, and even if you're not productive, you're still surviving thanks to state support. And in countries like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, countries were receiving companies were receiving subsidies, but if they failed to perform the targets, they were cut off from the subsidies. So they really felt the pressure to gain in productivity. Good platforms for public-private dialogue to share information and solve coordination failures. And actually, some of the work that now we're doing in my center is about the role of civil society in green industrial policy making, and especially help solve this kind of consultative process, right? Especially when governments lack the kind of right mechanisms to engage the private sector in a transparent way, or where so civil society and think tanks can really play this honest broker role and bring everyone around the table. Monitoring and evaluation, right, over time, which here the idea is really to learn from failure. And it's okay to fail. The whole point is how you adjust over time. And I believe there's a picture here of a very unpopular sport, curling. I don't know if you ever watched a curling game. It's extremely boring. But the reason why I have it here is because, as you might have noticed from before, I'm a bit obsessed with sports analogy. But here we should look at green industrial policy not as bowling, but as curling. You know, in bowling, you just throw the ball and you hope that it reaches, you know, those little bottles, you know, for a strike, and you can't touch it. But with curling, what you see the two ladies here doing, so you throw that thing on ice, and they actually, you know, brooming on the side to help adjust the direction, right, to make sure it hits the target. And this is how we should be thinking of industrial policy. It's not something that the government designed and now we can't touch it for 10 years. No, you design it, you review it. If something doesn't work, it's not like you scrap off everything and you start from scratch, which is what we're seeing everywhere in the world. There is this kind of mechanism from adjustment, and this is something that differentiates the countries that are able to industrialize on the long term from those that have like industrialization spurs and that break down immediately after. Next slide. And that leads to my final message, which is the need to go beyond policy imitation. This is one of the greatest danger that I see for green industrialization. Because you're seeing countries that are more and more imitating what others are doing, expecting that it will work in their context, but it doesn't, right? Most of the industrial policies that we see in green sectors nowadays tend to be in the US, in China. These are very large countries with a large domestic market size. They're able to do things that many other countries cannot do. And this is why it's really important to avoid the traps of policy imitations, but to really think about how to drive this policy at your own level. And this is both in terms of the tools that you use, in terms of the strategy, and in terms of the ecological priorities of what is green. So on the tools, for example, I don't think that's the case for Pakistan, but many countries, especially in Africa, they start to do local content requirements for solar and wind projects. So if you invest in renewables, you need to actually build the local the solar panels there. This is probably one of the worst in green industrial policy instruments that countries that lack pre-existing capabilities can do. And it's been shown that most of them have failed, right? It only worked in one country, which is China. And that's because, and the risk is that you actually make your renewable-based electricity more expensive, right? Because you don't have your locally produced panels might be more expensive. You'll never be able to compete with China internationally. So instead, it's better to find other niches, right, where there's still room for competition. In terms of defining green, next slide, please. Because again, the world is suffering from a form of carbon obsession. Climate change is a very important challenge that we have to deal with, but it's far from being the only one. And actually, carbon emissions reflect the responsibility of the West. And other countries might be dealing with more other ecological issues that might be more of a priority, like water stress, like material pollution, plastic pollution, including in oceans that affect fish and human health, which are not carbon pollution, but is pollution nonetheless, biodiversity loss, overuse of renewable resources. So I mentioned water, but it's also the same for fishing and so on. So green industrial policy doesn't have to be just about low carbon technologies, right? If in a country like Pakistan, you identify that, one of the biggest challenges you have to do is overuse of water or land, then perhaps your green industrial policy doesn't have to be about solar panels and wind turbines, but about something else that helps you deal with those issues. So this is why the book explains different types of context for different countries, in particular for agro-based countries and the logic of climate-smart agriculture. For small nations, if you're a small country like Togo, Guatemala, Mali, of course, you can't do the same things as others like Pakistan, India, China can do because they have a much larger domestic market. For biodiverse nations, and that's the whole point on biomimicry, and for fossil fuel producers. How much time do we have left?
We're almost over time.
Okay, so I won't go into these examples, but I'll go straight to the conclusion. Next. So actually, maybe I'll just mention this one. For small nations, so basically nations that don't have a domestic market demand for a particular good, countries have two options. Either they piggyback on their neighbors if they have a larger, more prosperous economy. And that's what Vietnam has done with China. That's what Poland has done with Germany. That's what Mexico has done with the US very successfully. But this strategy has downsides, which is you don't control the demand, right? You only supply. But what if the country's, the neighbor's demand does not align with your domestic development and ecological priorities? And if there is a shock in your neighbor's economy, then it affects you too. And the second strategy is what I like to call the getting a leg up to reach a green window. So if you're different countries, and this is an agenda that is increasing, getting increasing attention, which is the regionalization of green industrial policy. If for a country, it feels that it could compete in an area, but not on its own, there's great prospects for coordinating with a group of nations, which might be neighbors, to reach economies of scale, stabilize demand, align demand for particular projects where they see trade interest, and pool resources together for R&D, for example, to co-develop solutions. For R&D in particular, it makes so much sense to have one larger center than many small ones because of economies of scale issues. Next again. So this was the point on biodiversity as a bank of ideas. So many countries that have, and I know Pakistan has some areas that are highly biodiverse and beautiful. If you destroy those forests to put solar panel factories, I think we all agree that this is not sustainability and it's not development either. And here that part of the book looks at biodiversity as a bank of ideas for innovation. And actually throughout history, we've always looked towards nature for inspiration, and especially for sustainable technology. And whether you look at wind turbines, actually the shape of wind turbines is modeled after humpback whales' fins, right? And this is where we learn about the aerodynamic feature of those fins. The Japanese bullet train.
Can we finish in 2 minutes and we can take questions?
The Japanese bullet train is actually the Japanese scientists had a problem when designing the train. It didn't hit the sound wall in a way that it hit it in a way that created a loud banging noise. And it's by designing the front of the train by imitating a kingfisher's beak that they were able to solve this engineering issue, because the kingfisher has one of the most aerodynamic shape in the world. Next. So, in conclusions, the conditions for economic development are changing radically. So going green is not just an ecological act, but it's also an act of macroeconomic resilience. Industrial policy is becoming an increasingly powerful instrument to help achieve those issues, especially in an age where we're seeing so many polycrises, geopolitical tensions, climate change, populism, and so on. The decisions on what to produce, on how to produce, on where to produce them are way too important to leave to central governments and firms alone, which is why the industrial policy agenda now needs to involve more stakeholders, including civil society and think tanks like yourself. And lastly, I mostly talked about the policy levers at the national level, but something that I did not mention that is also highlighted in the book is what has to happen at the global level, because the playing field is not leveled, making it so much harder for developing countries to achieve the same goals as richer ones. And that's why we also need reforms of the international financial and trade architecture to help to ease the green industrialization prospects in developing nations. Next slide. So you can find my book here. It's actually completely free and open access online using this QR code. But also, if you look at the main page of the book online, it's only 100 pages. So it means that if you do read it and you don't like it, you don't lose time and you don't lose money, which is probably the most important argument for the book. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to this discussion with you.
Thank you, Dr. Amar, for a very insightful presentation and a very generous offer on book. Thank you so much. Let me go straight to questions, if we can. Please, I'll take 4 or 5 questions, then you can club your responses, but you have to be very crispy. We are out of time.
I noticed that there is a climate jargon, like if you observe RED plus, CBAM, all these terminologies, they are very messy for countries like Pakistan, where we take years or months to crack them, to understand in our context of industry. By the time we understand them, another concept emerges, and they say, no, now you don't have to focus on RED plus, you have to focus on green trading and other things. These Western countries do it deliberately, just to keep us at bay, to get the exact point where we have to be understanding the transition? And did you also observe this while writing your book?
Thank you. That's all.
Very much. Today, I meet people who are switching to solar panels without involving government. And after 1 or 2 months, some of them are buying electric bike also because of very reason. So my question is, obviously we all understand, as you have explained, that oil is the international reserve currency because dollar is pegged on that. If you don't sell oil, you will be doomed. So what is the natural time frame? What is the window when, if world does or doesn't, automatically the societies and the globe will adopt that? So there should be some time frame. So what is that time frame?
Thank you, Tarsa. And next, please.
Just one of the words, hallucination. Is there a hallucination around the theory of change, of green economy, climate action, or green industrialization? Because I mean, the way we have seen the meltdown in Baku, the decision paralysis around loss and damage, it's more like 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. I mean, why, like, if they're giving these frameworks, but why are they put legs around it, or giving a very clear trajectory? And it's just a second one that For developing countries like Pakistan, is it about mitigation at source or the end of pipeline solutions for green industrialization? I mean, if you factor in the cost of the financing or the cost of debt.
Thank you. I think you can respond and we can then have more questions. Ramila, हमें कब खत्म करना है? हाँ? Oh, thank you. We have time. Please go ahead.
One of the society environment. Yes.
My research, in my research, environment was one factor which got rejected in Pakistani data because I did from France, Marseille, with Ante Glavas is a big name you might be knowing in CSR. And in Pakistan, his point was rejected. And I was asked in my defense as well, what's the reason? What I could find is that in Pakistan, problem is not the policy and everything. On individual level, on educational level, people are not transformed to think about environment. We have got everything, but we don't have a thoughts. We have not built the nation to think about environment. All the CSR accepted, environment was rejected here. So I feel making policy on every level will not work unless and until educational policy is built on environment.
Go ahead, Dr. Amir. Dr. Amir,
Yeah.
so we can go.
So, on the jargon, I don't know if it's done on purpose or not, but it's a great barrier indeed. And actually, at COP negotiations, it creates a lot of unevenness because rich nations have large team of negotiators are able to follow up on all the things that are happening. I don't think it's necessarily intentional, but at least it's an outcome of this jargonization of climate. And I've met many countries in COP negotiations that, you know, they're not able to send many people. They have diplomats from the embassy attending, and they're completely lost, right? So you cannot really contribute or make your voice or your priorities heard because, you know, the discussion kind of flies over your head. But what I know is on purpose is a lot of the kind of environmental reasons, or at least the used environmental reasons to block imports of specific products, for example. So I know that from the 1980s onwards, the European Union has done that a lot to Malaysia when Malaysia tried to refine more of its palm oil, right? The EU hit back with many different types of quality environmental regulations and ISO certifications and whatnot, and they kept changing them to make it very difficult for Malaysian producers to keep adapting, right, to those new norms and regulations. So, and when it comes to, and what is on purpose though, not so much on the jargon, the justification. For example, the CBAM that you had mentioned, which is the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's a carbon tax at the border if you want to export something to the EU. They keep selling it as a climate measure. They say it's for climate, right? We're putting this tax so that we avoid leakage of carbon going somewhere else. But it's a trade measure. Because what people don't ask is, okay, you're doing this you're taxing, but why are you only taxing 6 products? Is the 6 products that they want to build an advantage in, and they're actually picking sectors that their main trade partners and allies are not exporting to the EU. But this way, the impact is felt on others, particularly China and African nations. The window for oil is a very good question. It's very hard to say because there's an element of game theory here, of what other actors do influences what you should be doing. But I would say that most of the scientific estimations have 2050 as a key date to reduce, I think it's about 90% of oil production, I think about 60% of gas production. But the main point, I think, is not to wait for others. If there are real opportunities in the green economy, we shouldn't be waiting for others to take the lead, but a lot of those decisions need to be made now. And I'll just mention one case which I found very interesting, which is the case of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very small nation, Central America, doesn't have the capabilities or economic scale for many different types to compete for, manufacturing solar panel or wind turbines. But what they've done is they made sure they went 100% renewables for the electricity matrix. And then and they didn't wait for the whole world to push them to do it. And now that they have 100%, electricity renewable in electricity in their electricity matrix, they're able to attract investments in high-tech sectors by telling companies, come, you just have to connect to the grid and you're already net zero. You're already decarbonized. You don't have to worry about getting solar panels and this. And you just bring your factory here and you have a net zero factory. And it's a great proposition for many companies that actually took those offers, right? So Intel has moved to Costa Rica. Now they have a large biomedical device manufacturing sector, and they're able to attract a lot of the technology services that are very energy intensive because they know that they can rely on Costa Rica's green energy. So this is an interesting way to go ahead of the curve and be prepared so that when the window comes and closes, your economy is already able to capture some of those opportunities. The third question on the hallucinations and Baku, I think we're seeing a lot of policy incoherence in many countries. And I think that comes from the fact that a lot of the climate agenda, as I was mentioning at the moment, unfortunately, is not motivated by ecological reasons, but really trade interests. And even when countries really push for the green economy, they want to push it in their own country. They want the jobs to be created in their country. And that makes it very, it leads to a lot of tensions and hypocrisy when talking about global climate responsibilities, because even when they actually finance climate mitigation measures or even adaptation measures in developing countries, it's always in the logic of, doing it either to mitigate for climate change, which is a Western responsibility, or to adapt, right, to reduce the symptoms of climate change, but rarely in the spirit of building resilience in those economies to help them also develop green industries. And I think that's a main source of tension that we see in places like Baku and others. And the very last question on, kind of how nations are geared or prepared or built to think about the environment. Something that I want to put for discussion here. I've done a little bit of work on this with Ali Al-Safar from the IEA and Aziz Al-Hibri, who does Islamic jurisprudence. And something that we were very interested by, a puzzle, which is why Muslim societies are not more concerned or more vocal about climate change. And when you look at the world, actually, Muslim majority nations are amongst some of the most regressive nations when it comes to climate action, including in Baku and so on, because of fossil fuel production and other means. But each country, you need to find different ways to talk about climate change, no? And one of the ways, I think there is a very strong theological link. And if you look at Islamic scripture, it's very, very clear that it's extremely focused on sustainability, and not just in a very holistic way, from biodiversity protection, from the value of species, right, of God's creation, from the idea of from the dangers of overconsumption, including of water, and even the concept of khilafah, which is custodianship. And so, the idea here is very clear that humans are not sovereigns on earth, but custodians. And custody implies protection. And in places like Brazil, for example, they found that in the Bible, there are similar things, perhaps less as focused. But in Brazil, for example, there's an organization that found that they got people to care a lot about climate change, environmental protection, by talking about it through religious means, right? And I think you mentioned Pakistan, something that I'm putting up for discussion is actually, and honestly, we haven't really found the answer as to why, Muslim societies don't talk as much about climate change. And the tragedy is that today, this agenda seems to come from those that actually have polluted the most that are now coming, and they're also owning the climate discourse. And there's a great danger for many societies. Yeah.
Because I worked in Pakistan and France both together and being a teacher as well as now. We don't have our own infrastructure in education to educate people about environment. We are based on the books, people come from there, we get impressed, we follow their lines, their rules, regulations, or even yesterday I was teaching the policy writing to my student of HR and communication. I didn't have any Pakistani written code where I could give any example. So I put it the US book and everyone has said, okay, go to the Pakistani policies from such and such, and then make this assignment. So in education sector, we spend less. We don't educate people that start, like why I've brought these people here to listen and to go back and to tell others. And I have taken your book from my first book as well, inshallah. I'll send you the details. I keep these kinds of books in my syllabus. I give them projects, and I make all the lessons from those books. So which I'm doing individual, but individual cannot bring change every time. There's need a policy in education. So they can bring this change. So thankful to sir that he gives a chance to listen to you, and inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, Dr. Irfan, go ahead.
Amir.
So, I guess the way China or US, they have been making some moves in the green industrial sector. I believe that partly it was because of slowdown in their own industrial growth over the past decade, because there was lots of industrial concentration even both in US and China, and I think as a response to that, green industrial sectors, they have been identified as some new drivers of growth. So in China, for example, in the last 2 or 3 years, their GDP growth, it was mainly being driven by the green industrial sectors. So do you think that very proactive or aggressive green industrial policies, they are going to again create concentration or clustering in the green industry itself, and maybe even these developed economies, they may face slowdown in the industrial growth, in particularly by focusing too much. Eventually, I think although it's environmentally friendly, but some way you are incentivizing or or maybe even distorting some of the equilibrium policies. So do you think it will again create concentration or slowdown in the overall industrial growth in China or US coming 10 to 5 years?
Thank you. Any more questions from the room? I have received 2 questions in written. What policy measures can Pakistan adopt to incentivize industries to transition towards greener practices while remaining globally competitive? And the second question that I have been requested to ask, what are the possible costs to adopt the green practices and how Pakistan can hedge these costs? It's yours.
So on the first question, yeah, absolutely. So with the current industrial geography of decarbonization, it will push most of the developing world further behind. And it reproduces the same historical patterns of extractivism, even now for critical minerals that you need for low carbon technologies, things like copper, lithium, cobalt. They're mostly, this is going to be basically developing countries are inserted into the global economy as raw materials providers with all the problems that it brings and that we know about from history, on dependency theory, declining terms of trade, and also environmental pollution. A lot of people talk, I don't know if it's the same here, but including in the UK, say, electric vehicles, They're not so clean. There's a lot of mining that goes in there. It's true. But the problem is not just this, is that the pollution from mining, the added pollution from mining in electric cars, is like, where does that pollution take place? It's that pollution is taking place in developing nations when you're producing those mining, and the ecological benefits are from rich consumer markets when you're driving the car, right? And you're seeing a lot more of this kind of dumping of materials and waste in developing nations. And we're going really in that direction. So I'm very pessimistic on this front, including on green hydrogen, which I assume perhaps SDP has done some work on it. I'm sure the German Development Corporation has pushed for work on green hydrogen as well. But green hydrogen, you see a complete renewed dependencies. Because what's the point of green hydrogen? It's actually 2 points. It's one of as energy storage. The other one is for as an energy carrier. But now when you look at the geography of green hydrogen projects, it's mostly about extracting, right, using green hydrogen production in the global south and shipping it as a raw energy source to decarbonize basically German industry, right? But green hydrogen is very water intensive. It has some ecological issues. The economics of it are not yet very clear. So, there was the Namibian Minister of Energy likes to say that Namibia will be exporting its sunshine to Germany, thanks to green hydrogen. But the truth is, it's not the sunshine that they're exporting, is water, and it's one of the most water stressed country in the world. So we see a lot of this, and in one way we cannot be naive, because developed nations, industrialized nations, they're seeing their own interest right at first, and they're pursuing it. So the issue is actually us, that we are actually letting them do it. And we're believing that this is all about climate and not putting the own interest in terms of coordination. So there is a lot that needs to be done, especially in terms of South-South cooperation, building alternative narratives of what would be an equitable green economy that doesn't reproduce the same international division of labor. In terms of policy measures, I think that I will follow what the university professor has said, in the sense that each country really has to find the measure that works. So I have in mind a list of measures that could be, that have worked in many different places. But the issue is that, those measures are also highly political, but also countries, like societies, need to own them. So they need to come from a consultative process with different, segments of society, including academia and think tanks, the private sector. The private sector's views really need to be included, not for the sake of the general, wishy-washy public-private dialogue partnership. No, but actually because you need them to have buy-in. And if you impose targets on them without consulting them, sometimes the targets might not be realistic, right? But if there is a dialogue, which is done through neutral platforms, in which them themselves say, that's actually the target that we could reach, that is credible, then you already have basically a business sector that is willing to get to that, to get to that place. I've seen many countries in which governments designed beautiful green industrial policy strategies, the best ones, all the instruments are there, all the conditions, everything, but then they led nowhere because they have them, but then, the other segments of society didn't really follow, no? They were not really a part of it. And the last one on costs, what's the cost? Very good question, very costly. It's costly, those investments are costly and they're risky. That has to be said. However, we shouldn't just look at the cost. We should also, on its own, we should look at the cost of the alternative. What is the cost of not doing anything, of keeping the status quo? And you will find that sometimes it's much higher and it's much riskier. I come from a country where 95% of our exports are oil and gas, 95%. And, when you look at green diversification and so on, and people say, yeah, but, that costs a lot. Okay, that costs a lot. But if you don't do anything, you're guaranteed a huge cost, all right? Because in 50 years, 40, maybe less, we won't be able to, basically most of our exports might disappear. Actually, we're consuming more and more of our own fossil fuels to the point that within 5 years, we might not have any gas. We have to import gas to meet the demand. So this is the context in which those green industrial policy and green industrialization shouldn't be seen in terms of its cost, but more of its investment. right? And how much it will generate. So it needs a positivist twist on the green economy. That, you know, it's about bringing jobs, it's about creating value, it's about foreign exchange generation, and not just about, you know, meeting climate targets just because Germany said so and because, you know, there's public pressure to do it.
Any last pressing questions? Oh, they're good audience. They don't have.
Hmm?
They're good audience. They don't have questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Amir, for bringing us in what I will call an alternate version on green economies. There's a rush on buzzwords, greening, and I don't know what they have learned, but to me it was really a different perspective that you have brought in, and I'm sure it will generate the debates. And many congratulations on this book. I'm sure this will be creating some sort of stays in the waves when you go on the forums, because it really brings you a different picture of what generally people are talking about. And also, I would like to congratulate in the kind of the policy context that you have in mind while writing this book. It's both an academic, it can be, but more, let's say, in the policy angle that you bring to us, and I'm sure to many more going forward. I once again thank you and congratulate you on this book on behalf of SDPI, the entire people who are sitting here. On behalf of SDPI and Dr. Amir, I'm also thankful to you as well for taking time out and joining us and some very good questions. Thank you. Now we will present souvenir to Dr. Amir. If I can request Dr. Farina to come with us.
Thank you for hosting me. And I didn't mean to give a very pessimistic picture. It's just, and the whole point of the book was to encourage policymakers in developing nations to not leave this to the rich nations, but get in there. And as Antonio Gramsci has said, you must have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. So hopefully together, and we'll keep the discussion to make
Yes.
that happen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So this is from us.
Thank you.
We
This is
will
very
also
kind.
Dr. Priya with us as well. Priya, apologies. Challenge, the cameraman works on it. Thank you. Thank you.
That's very kind of you.
We got it there. We will also, hopefully you have given us a smaller book to read. We have given you so many books to read.
Oh, wow.
We are reserving a multiple times.
I win in the trade.
Yes.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farida.
थैंक यू आप सबका बहुत शुक्रिया। मैंने बहुत कोशिश की कि पानी पी के मेरे गले की जो खराबी है वो आप तक ना पहुंचे माइक के जरिए, बट स्टिल माय अपॉलॉजीज कुछ थैंक यू।
RP is